Alright, let's go. Number 10, the Bimini Road and the underwater pavement that should not exist. On the morning of September 1968, three divers swimming in shallow water off the northwestern coast of North Bimini in the Bahamas surfaced with stories of something beneath them that they could not explain. Joseph Manson Valentine, a zoologist working with the Caribbean Research Centres, along with Jacques Mayol and Robert Angove, had descended into approximately 5 metres of clear Bahamian water and discovered a linear arrangement of massive limestone blocks running along the seafloor for nearly half a kilometre. The blocks were rectangular. They were arranged in a way that suggested intentional pavement rather than random geological deposition. Some of them measured up to 4 metres across. The formation came to be known as the Bimini Road, and the controversy surrounding it has not been resolved in the nearly 60 years since its discovery. The dimensions of the formation are what makes it particularly unsettling. The structure stretches for approximately 800 metres in a J-shaped pattern. The blocks are arranged along a remarkably consistent north-south orientation. Many of them sit on what appear to be supporting pillars of smaller stones, raising sections of the pavement above the surrounding seafloor. To divers swimming above it, the formation looks unmistakably constructed. To geologists who have examined it in detail, the consensus has settled on natural beach rock formation, a process by which calcium carbonate cements together coastal sediments and the resulting layers fracture along regular lines as sea levels change. But here is where the conventional explanation runs into difficulty. The blocks of the Bimini Road sit at a depth that would have placed them above water during the last glacial maximum approximately 20,000 years ago. As the ice sheets melted and sea levels rose, the platform that now sits beneath the Bahamian shallows would have been submerged sometime between 10,000 and 8,000 years ago. If anything was built on that platform during the period when humans were known to be present in the Americas, it would have been drowned by the same rising waters that erased Doggerland in the North Atlantic. Researchers, including marine geologist Eugene Shin of the United States Geological Survey, have argued strongly that the formation is purely natural. Others, including the late Manson Valentine himself and researchers from the Association for Research and Enlightenment, have continued to insist that certain features of the road, including the apparent supporting pillars and the suggestion of tool marks on some blocks, indicate at minimum that natural rock formations were modified or arranged by human hands. The truly disturbing aspect is the implication if the modification interpretation is correct. The shallow waters around Bimini cover what was once dry land at the end of the last ice age. Whatever existed on that land before the seas rose has been submerged for approximately 10,000 years. The Bimini Road may be a coincidental natural pattern, or it may be the only visible fragment of something far larger that lies beneath the surrounding sediment, waiting in shallow Caribbean water for an investigation that mainstream archaeology has been reluctant to fund. The flood that drowned the Bahamian platform was not a single event. It was the same global rise in sea levels that reshaped every coastline on Earth between approximately 14,000 and 6,000 BCE. The geological flood whose memory survives in the mythologies of every continent. If anyone built anything on the platform now occupied by Bimini, they did so in a world that no longer exists. And the proof of their existence has been lying under 5 metres of water for so long that the marine organisms growing on the blocks have erased whatever evidence might once have distinguished them as artificial. Number 9. The Yonaguni Monument and the staircase beneath the East China Sea. In the spring of 1986, a Japanese diving instructor named Kiichiro Aratake was scouting new diving locations off the southern coast of Yonaguni Island, the westernmost inhabited island of Japan, sitting just 111 kilometres east of Taiwan. Aratake was not searching for archaeology. He was looking for hammerhead sharks which migrate through the area each winter and draw divers from across the world. What he found instead, at a depth of approximately 25 metres beneath the Pacific surface, was a massive stone formation that appeared to consist of terraced platforms. Vertical walls and step surfaces arranged with a regularity that has divided researchers for nearly 40 years. The formation that became known as the Yonaguni Monument measures approximately 100 metres long, 50 metres wide, and rises 25 metres from the seafloor. Marine geologist Masaaki Kimura of the University of the Ryukyus has spent decades diving the site and has described features he interprets as a road, a castle, a stadium, and what he calls a sphinx-like figure. He argues that the angles, the right angle corners, and the consistency of the stepped surfaces cannot be explained by purely natural processes acting on the local sandstone. Kimura's most recent estimates place the construction of the monument at between 2,000 and 3,000 years ago, though his earlier estimates suggested it could be 10,000 years old, dating it to a period when the platform would have been above water. The geological setting matters here. The rocks of Yonaguni are sandstone deposited approximately 20 million years ago in the early Miocene. They sit on a tectonic fault line that has been seismically active for the entire history of human occupation of the Ryukyu Islands. Geologist Robert Schoch of Boston University has examined the formation in person and concluded that it is primarily natural, the product of layered sandstone fracturing along bedding planes and vertical joints. During repeated earthquake activity, he acknowledges that it looks artificial, that the stepped appearance is striking, and that the parallel edges and right angles are unusual. But he argues that similar formations exist on land elsewhere in the Ryukyu chain, including at the Sananudai geosite on Yonaguni itself, where stepped sandstone formations identical in appearance to the underwater monument are exposed above sea level. What makes Yonaguni particularly unsettling is what sits between the natural and artificial interpretations. Schoch has stated that even if the monument is 95% natural, sections of it may have been modified by ancient humans. The Jomon culture of prehistoric Japan, which produced the oldest pottery on Earth at approximately 14,500 BCE, occupied the Ryukyu Islands during the period when sea levels were low enough that the monument would have been above water. The Jomon were not primitive nomads. They built permanent villages, conducted long-distance trade, and produced sophisticated ceremonial objects across more than 12,000 years of continuous cultural development. Whether or not they modified Yonaguni, they would have walked across its surface during the last glacial period when the platform formed part of a coastal terrace stretching toward what is now Taiwan. The truly disturbing aspect is the timeline. If even a fraction of Yonaguni was modified by human hands, the modification occurred before approximately 8,000 BCE, when rising sea levels finally submerged the platform. The Pacific Rim, from Taiwan to the Japanese archipelago, contained vast stretches of coastal lowland during the Ice Age that have all been swallowed by the same global flood. The 1771 tsunami that struck the Sakishima Islands threw an 830-ton coral boulder more than 2 kilometres inland. Run-up heights may have reached 85 metres. The same coastline has absorbed similar catastrophes for thousands of years, according to research by Daisuke Arioka at the University of Tokyo, whose team identified evidence of comparable tsunamis recurring across more than 2,000 years of geological history. Whatever existed on the dry land that is now beneath Yonaguni was first drowned, then repeatedly battered by waves capable of moving stone blocks weighing hundreds of tons. The monument may be natural. It may be modified. It may be the last visible fragment of something we cannot reach. The water has been keeping the answer for approximately 10,000 years, and the only people who could tell us what was built there left no descendants to remember. Number 8, Gunung Padang and the contested pyramid of West Java. On a wooded hilltop, approximately 50 kilometres southwest of the city of Cianjur in West Java, Indonesia rises a stepped formation that local villagers have known about for centuries. They call it Gunung Padang, the Mountain of Light. For most of its documented history, the site was treated as a moderately interesting megalithic terrace structure built by prehistoric Indonesian communities perhaps 2,000 to 6,000 years ago. The visible surface consists of 5 distinct terraces arranged at the top of the hill, constructed from columnar basaltic stones that were quarried from the surrounding volcanic landscape and stacked into walls and platforms. Then in 2011, a team led by Indonesian geologist Danny Hilman Natawijaja began conducting subsurface investigations using ground-penetrating radar, seismic tomography, and core drilling. What they reported across the following decade has produced one of the most contentious archaeological debates of the 21st century. According to Natawijaja and his collaborators, Gunung Padang is not merely a hill with megalithic structures on top. It is a multi-layered constructed pyramid extending dozens of meters into the hillside below the visible surface. Their radiocarbon analysis of organic material recovered from core samples returned dates that, if accepted, would place the earliest construction phases at between 9,000 and 27,000 years before present. The oldest reported date approached 25,000 BCE, which would make Gunung Padang older than Göbekli Tepe by more than 15,000 years and place its construction during the height of the last glacial maximum. The 2023 paper publishing these results in the journal Archaeological Prospection generated immediate controversy. Critics argued that the radiocarbon-dated soil samples were not associated with any artifacts or features that could reliably be interpreted as human-made. The journal retracted the paper on March 18, 2024, citing what they called a major error not identified during peer review. The retraction notice concluded that the interpretation of the site as a 9,000-year-old or older pyramid was incorrect based on the evidence presented. Mainstream archaeology has settled on a date of approximately 2,000 years for the visible surface structures based on charcoal samples directly associated with the architecture analysed by Indonesian archaeologist Lutfi Yondri. But here is where the situation becomes genuinely difficult to resolve. The retraction did not prove that the lower layers are natural. It concluded that the evidence presented was insufficient to support the specific claim of human construction at extreme antiquity. The subsurface anomalies detected by ground-penetrating radar still exist. The chambers and apparent voids identified in the seismic tomography are still there. Whether they represent natural geological features within the volcanic hillside or whether they represent something built by human hands during a period when human construction is supposed to have been impossible, the question has not been definitively answered. What makes Gunung Padang particularly unsettling is what it represents regardless of how the dating debate ultimately resolves. The fact that credible researchers were willing to consider the possibility of a 25,000-year-old constructed monument in tropical Indonesia tells us something about how little we actually know about the deep past of Southeast Asia. The Indonesian archipelago sits at the edge of the drowned continent of Sundaland, a vast lowland plain twice the size of India that was exposed during the last glacial maximum and submerged completely between approximately 14,000 and 7,000 BCE. Whatever existed on Sundaland during the period when humans had been living in Southeast Asia for at least 50,000 years has been beneath hundreds of feet of ocean for thousands of years. Gunung Padang sits on volcanic high ground that would have remained above water through every flood event that has affected the region. If anything was built before the great flooding events drowned Sundaland, the highlands of Java are exactly where surviving evidence might be expected to remain. The truly disturbing aspect is the silence. The site has been semi-excavated, partially studied, and largely abandoned by the institutions that would otherwise have the authority to resolve the question. The visible structures are real. The subsurface anomalies are real. The question of whether anyone in the deep past stacked basalt columns into a pyramid 25,000 years before history was supposed to begin remains officially unanswered. And Gunung Padang continues to sit on its hilltop in West Java, watching the centuries pass without telling anyone what it is. Number 7. The Bosnian Pyramid Complex and the tunnels beneath Visotica. In April 2005, a Bosnian-American businessman and amateur researcher named Semir Osmanagic visited the small town of Visoko in central Bosnia and Herzegovina, approximately 30 kilometers northwest of Sarajevo. He climbed a hill known locally as Visočica, which rises approximately 213 meters above the surrounding valley floor, and made a public claim that would draw international attention and condemnation in equal measure. Osmanagic, who had previously studied pre-Columbian pyramids in Central and South America, declared that Visočica was not a natural hill. He argued that it was an artificial pyramid, potentially the largest in the world, and that several other hills in the surrounding valley formed a complex of pyramid structures aligned to the cardinal directions and connected by underground tunnels. The scale of the claim was extraordinary. Visočica's 4 distinct sides appeared to face precisely north, south, east, and west. The slopes formed approximately equal triangular faces. Core samples taken from the surface layers revealed what Osmanagics identified as shaped stone blocks, joined with a binding material he described as an ancient form of concrete. If his interpretation was correct, the structure he named the Bosnian Pyramid of the Sun would be older, larger, and more geometrically precise than any known pyramid in the archaeological record. The response from mainstream archaeology was immediate and severe. The European Association of Archaeologists issued a public statement in 2006, signed by dozens of academics condemning the claims as a hoax and a threat to the genuine archaeological heritage of the region. Geological surveys conducted by independent researchers identified Vesosica as a flat iron, a natural hill formation produced by differential erosion of tilted sedimentary rock layers. The shaped blocks were interpreted as natural breccia formations. The binding material was identified as mineralized sediment. The geometric regularity was dismissed as perceptual bias and confirmation. But here is where the standard dismissal becomes complicated. Beneath the town of Visoko itself, separate from the contested pyramid claim, lies a system of underground passages designated the Ravni Tunnel Complex. These tunnels are undeniably artificial. Large stone blocks within the passages show clear tool marks. Some of the blocks are inscribed with symbols whose dating remains uncertain, but which various researchers have placed at between 12,000 and 30,000 years old. The tunnels extend for unknown distances beneath the valley, and partial excavation since 2006 has uncovered chambers, side passages, and structural features that no documented Balkan civilization is recognised as having been capable of constructing. The Ravni tunnels by themselves represent a major archaeological anomaly. No known culture in the Balkans during the late Paleolithic or Mesolithic period had the demonstrated capability to construct subterranean infrastructure on this scale. The purpose of the tunnels, the identity of the builders, and their relationship to the surface formations remain unresolved. What makes the Bosnian situation particularly unsettling is what the controversy has done to the genuine anomalies on the site. Mainstream archaeology has largely avoided Visoko because of its association with the contested pyramid claim, meaning that documented features within the tunnel system are not being investigated with the resources they would otherwise receive. The truly disturbing aspect is the timing implied by the most aggressive dating estimates. If any of the older interpretations of the Ravna tunnel inscriptions are accurate, the construction would predate every accepted civilization in Europe by tens of thousands of years. The end of the last ice age and the catastrophic flooding events that erased Doggerland and submerged the Black Sea Basin would have occurred long after the tunnels were already in place. The hilltop of Visotska, like Gunung Padang on the other side of the world, sits on volcanic geology that has remained stable for far longer than any flood could affect. Whatever happened in the Bosanska Valley in deep prehistory, the controversy has ensured that the question will not be resolved in any of our lifetimes, and the tunnels continue to extend into darkness beneath. Central Bosnia, semi-excavated and officially ignored, preserving by neglect whatever truth they were built to contain. Number 6. The Wall of Jericho and the first city defending itself against nothing. Approximately 12 kilometres north of the Dead Sea in the Jordan River Valley sits a low mound of accumulated debris that locals call Tel es Sultan, the Mound of the Sultan. Beneath that mound lies the oldest continuously inhabited urban site on Earth, the prehistoric core of the city we now call Jericho. Archaeological excavations conducted between 1952 and 1958 by the British archaeologist Kathleen Kenyon revealed something that fundamentally rewrote the timeline of human civilization. At the lowest occupation layer, dating to approximately 8,000 BCE, during the pre-pottery Neolithic A period, Kenyon uncovered a massive stone wall surrounding a settlement of mud brick houses. The wall measured at least 3.6 metres high and 1.8 metres thick at its base. It enclosed a settlement of perhaps 2,000 to 3,000 inhabitants who had been living in the same location for at least 500 years before the construction began. They cultivated emmer wheat, barley, and pulses. They hunted wild gazelle and aurochs. They had no domesticated livestock, no metal tools, and no pottery. And yet, around 8,000 BCE, they did something no human community had ever done before. They built the world's first city wall. The construction required quarrying tons of undressed stone, transporting it to the site and stacking it into a continuous defensive perimeter around the entire settlement. The labour involved was enormous. The social organisation required to feed and direct that labour was unprecedented. And the most disturbing detail is what archaeology has uncovered about the threats the wall was designed to repel. There is no evidence of organised warfare in the region during this period. There are no contemporaneous communities large enough or aggressive enough to threaten Jericho. There are no records of raiding cultures, no signs of military pressure, no defensive needs that conventional explanations can account for. The people of Jericho built the world's first city wall for reasons that the archaeological record cannot reconstruct. Some researchers have proposed alternative explanations. The wall may have served as a flood defence, protecting the settlement from seasonal mudflows pouring down from the surrounding hills. Recent analysis by Ofer Bar Yosef at Harvard University and others has suggested that the wall functioned primarily to control sediment and water flow rather than to repel human attackers. But the construction effort involved seems disproportionate to flood control needs alone, and the wall was repeatedly maintained, expanded and rebuilt across multiple generations of occupation. Whatever it was defending against, the threat was significant enough to justify centuries of communal labour invested in stone barriers around a community that had no other reason to fortify itself. What makes the Jericho Wall particularly unsettling is its temporal context. The structure was built within a few centuries of the climate transition that ended the last ice age. The Younger Dryas, the sudden return to near-glacial conditions that I am sure many of you have heard about, ended around 9,700 BCE with rapid global warming. Sea levels began rising at unprecedented rates as ice sheets collapsed. Coastal communities across the eastern Mediterranean were watching their landscapes drown. The descendants of those displaced populations may have flooded into the Jordan Valley, contributing to the population pressure that produced the urban density at Jericho. The wall may have been a response to refugee waves rather than to organised warfare, a defensive response to the mass migrations triggered by the Great Flood that was reshaping every coastline on Earth. The truly disturbing aspect is the timing. Whatever drove humanity to build its first city wall happened during the same window in which the climate of the planet was reorganising itself, when the seas were rising, when the Sahara was beginning to green, when entire regions of land were vanishing beneath the waves. The Wall of Jericho was the first human attempt to fortify a civilization against forces we no longer fully understand. It was built before the Great Floods finished reshaping the world, and it has stood layer by layer beneath the rebuilt city ever since. Number 5. The Atlit Yam Stone Circle and the drowned village beneath the Mediterranean. In October 1984, marine archaeologist Ehud Galili was conducting a routine survey of the Carmel coast of Israel when he noticed something unusual in the sediment, approximately 400 metres offshore from the modern town of Atlit, 10 kilometres south of the city of Haifa. Diving down to a depth of 8 to 12 metres beneath the Mediterranean surface, Galili and his team uncovered the preserved remains of an entire Neolithic village. The site, designated Atlit Yam, has been radiocarbon dated to between 6,900 and 6,300 BCE, making it one of the largest and most completely preserved submerged prehistoric settlements ever discovered. The village covered approximately 40,000 square metres of what was once dry land along the ancient Mediterranean shoreline. The inhabitants had built rectangular stone houses with hearths and grinding installations. They had dug a stone-lined well to a depth of 5.5 metres to access fresh groundwater. They had cultivated wheat and barley, herded goats, and developed an extraordinarily sophisticated marine economy that depended on diving for seafood. The skeletons recovered from the site, including 65 sets of human remains, show signs of auditory exostosis, the characteristic ear damage caused by repeated cold water diving. The men of Atlit Yam had been spending so much time underwater hunting fish and shellfish that their ear canals had begun to grow protective bone overgrowths. But the most extraordinary feature of Atlit Yam sits at the centre of the submerged settlement. 7 megalithic stones, arranged in a semicircle weighing up to 600 kilograms each and standing between 1 and 2.1 metres tall, form a deliberate ceremonial structure. The stones have cut marks carved into their surfaces. They were originally arranged around a freshwater spring, suggesting they served some kind of ritual function connected to the water that sustained the village. A separate installation at the site consists of 3 oval stones, 2 of which are circumscribed by carved grooves forming schematic anthropomorphic figures. The people of Atlet Yam were not subsistence farmers scraping by at the edge of survival. They were a sophisticated coastal civilization with religious traditions, ceremonial architecture, and a level of technological capability that places them among the most advanced communities of the pre-pottery Neolithic sea period. And then their world ended. The cause of the village's destruction has been debated since its discovery. The settlement appears to have been abandoned suddenly, with piles of fish ready for trade or storage left in place as if the inhabitants had fled in haste. An Italian study led by Maria Pereschi of the Italian National Institute of Geophysics and Volcanology in Pisa proposed that a volcanic collapse on the eastern flank of Mount Etna, approximately 8,500 years ago, triggered a tsunami estimated at 40 metres in height that swept across the Mediterranean within hours. Atlet Yam may have been one of the coastal communities destroyed by that wave. Other researchers have argued for a more gradual abandonment driven by salinisation of the well as rising sea levels contaminated the freshwater aquifer. The stone circle, however, remains standing where its builders had placed it, suggesting that whatever caused the abandonment did not produce the kind of total destruction a 40-metre tsunami would have left behind. What makes Atlet Yam particularly unsettling is what its skeletons have revealed. The remains of a young woman and her infant child, recovered in 2008 from the submerged sediment, contain the earliest known evidence of tuberculosis in human history. The disease patterns visible in their bones indicate that the mother passed the infection to her child shortly after birth. They died approximately 9,000 years ago on a coastline that no longer exists, in a village that has been beneath the Mediterranean for longer than any pyramid has been standing. The truly disturbing aspect is the preservation. The sandy seabed has held the village in place across 9 millennia. The stone circle still stands. The houses, though collapsed, retain their floor plans. The graves, including the burials of children placed inside the dwellings of the living, still hold their occupants. An entire civilization built ceremonial megaliths around a freshwater spring on the coast of the Mediterranean, and then the great flood that drowned every Mesolithic coastline on Earth came for them too. The water rose, the wells salted, the fields drowned, and whatever they believed about the stones they had erected, their final ceremony was performed in a village that was already being consumed by the rising sea. Number 4, the Nabta Playa Stone Circle and the astronomy of the Green Sahara. Approximately 800 kilometres south of Cairo, deep in the Nubian desert of southern Egypt, lies a region of windswept sand that today supports almost no life. During the African humid period, however, this region was a fertile basin containing seasonal lakes fed by monsoon rainfall that had shifted northward across the Sahara. Cattle herders, farmers, and astronomers occupied the area for thousands of years before the climate dried again and the desert reclaimed everything. In 1974, anthropologist Fred Wendorf of Southern Methodist University was returning from an expedition in Libya when he and his team nearly walked past a feature in the desert that would turn out to be one of the most important archaeological discoveries in African prehistory. Embedded in the sand of an ancient lake bed, partially eroded by wind, sat a circular arrangement of stone slabs that had been deliberately erected by human hands. The site is called Nabta Playa, and its construction dates to between approximately 7,500 and 4,800 BCE, depending on which structures within the larger complex are being examined. The stone circle itself, the so-called calendar circle, that has drawn the most attention, was built around 4,800 BCE. But the broader Nabta Playa ceremonial landscape extends back to approximately 7,000 BCE, predating Stonehenge by 2,000 years, and making the site potentially the oldest astronomical observatory ever discovered. The calendar circle consists of 6 inner stones, surrounded by 29 standing stones, arranged with what astrophysicist Thomas Brophy and astronomer Kim Malville of the University of Colorado have argued is precise alignment to celestial events. 2 pairs of stone slabs mark out the cardinal direction of north and the position of the sunrise on the summer solstice. Additional alignments appear to correspond to the rising positions of Arcturus, Sirius, and Alpha Centauri at the time the structures were erected. Brophy has proposed, controversially, that the southern alignment of 3 stones inside the calendar circle represents the stars of Orion's belt, while 3 additional stones represent the head and shoulders of the Orion constellation. The construction of these alignments required sustained observation of the sky across decades, encoding seasonal and stellar information into permanent stone markers. Beyond the calendar circle, the broader Nabta Playa complex contains at least 30 megalithic structures, including burial chambers for cattle tumuli covering deliberately interred animal remains, and lines of standing stones extending for kilometers across the ancient lakebed. The cattle burials are particularly striking. The herders of Nabta Playa interred their cattle in clay-lined chambers covered by stone tumuli, treating the animals with a ceremonial care that suggests elaborate religious beliefs centered on bovine symbolism. The cattle of Nabta Playa may represent the ideological precursors of the sacred bulls that would later appear throughout dynastic Egyptian religion thousands of years later. What makes Nabta Playa particularly unsettling is what happened to its builders. The African humid period began drying around 5,500 years ago. The monsoon belt retreated southward as Earth's orbital parameters shifted. The lakes that had supported the cattle herding civilization began to evaporate. The grasslands turned to dust. The Nabta Playa population could not stay where they were. They migrated, carrying their cattle, their astronomical knowledge, and their ceremonial traditions with them. And the most likely destination of those refugees was the Nile Valley to the east. Some archaeologists, including Fekriya Hassan at University College London, have argued that the population influx from the drying Sahara provided the demographic and cultural foundation that catalysed the emergence of dynastic Egyptian civilization. The pyramids, the pharaohs, the hieroglyphs, the entire cultural legacy of ancient Egypt may exist in part because climate refugees from places like Nabta Playa concentrated along the Nile and brought their stones, their stars, and their cattle with them. The truly disturbing aspect is what the alignments represent. The Nabta Playa builders were tracking celestial events across decades and encoding the results into permanent stone markers thousands of years before any known civilization had developed writing. They knew the sky. They watched it carefully enough to align stones with stars whose positions had shifted slightly over generations. And then their world dried up beneath them, and they walked away from their observatory, carrying the knowledge that would eventually become the foundation of Egyptian astronomy. The stones they left behind have been removed to a museum in Aswan to protect them from vandalism. Replicas now stand in the desert where the originals were placed. Whatever the builders saw in the sky 7,000 years ago, the descendants of their tradition recorded it across millennia, and the original stones still align with the stars they were meant to honour, even as the desert that surrounds them has forgotten that any of it ever happened. Number 3. The Tower of Jericho and the staircase that climbed into the sky. Inside the same Tel Es Sultan mound that contained the world's first city wall sits a structure that pushes the boundaries of what pre-pottery Neolithic A communities are supposed to have been capable of constructing. When Kathleen Kenyon excavated Jericho between 1952 and 1958, she did not just find the wall. Pressed against the inside of the wall, on the western side of the settlement, stood a massive cylindrical stone tower. The Tower of Jericho measures 8.5 metres tall and approximately 9 metres in diameter at its base, narrowing to 7 metres at the top. Its walls are 1.5 metres thick. It was constructed from undressed stones, quarried from the local landscape and assembled without mortar into a self-supporting cone that has remained standing for 10,000 years. Radiocarbon dating places its construction at approximately 8,300 BCE, with continuous use until around 7,800 BCE. For roughly 5,000 years after its construction, the Tower of Jericho was the tallest human-made structure on Earth. It held that record until the Pyramid of Djoser was built in Egypt around 2650 BCE. The interior contains a remarkable feature that no other contemporary structure preserves. A spiral staircase of 22 stone steps ascends through the centre of the tower from base to summit. The construction of the staircase required the architects to design the interior space with the steps in mind, building them into the structural fabric rather than adding them as an afterthought. The level of architectural planning involved is unprecedented for the period. The labour required to quarry, transport and assemble the stones is estimated at approximately 11,000 workdays, an enormous investment for a community of 2,000 to 3,000 people without metal tools, draft animals, or wheels. The original interpretation of the tower assumed it was defensive, a watchtower providing a vantage point over the surrounding landscape and serving as a refuge during attacks. But subsequent analysis has eliminated this explanation. There were no organised military threats to PPNA Jericho during the period of the tower's construction. No rival cities existed within striking distance. No raiding cultures have been documented in the contemporary archaeological record. The defensive interpretation has been steadily abandoned by mainstream archaeology, leaving the question of the tower's actual purpose fundamentally unresolved. In 2008, archaeologists Ran Barkai and Roy Liren of Tel Aviv University published a study proposing a remarkable alternative interpretation. Using computer modelling of solar angles and shadow projections, they demonstrated that on the evening of the summer solstice, the shadow of the nearby mountain Caruntal falls precisely on the tower at the exact moment the sun sets behind the peak. The shadow then spreads across the entire town in the minutes that follow. The tower was positioned with deliberate astronomical precision to mark the longest day of the year. The construction of the staircase up the interior may have been related to ceremonial ascents performed at specific moments in the solar calendar. What makes the Tower of Jericho particularly unsettling is the cognitive sophistication it implies. The builders had to observe the sun's annual cycle for years or decades to determine the exact alignment they needed. They had to plan a structure capable of holding its position across centuries. They had to coordinate the labour force required to build it. And they had to do all of this while also constructing the world's first city wall, maintaining an agricultural economy and developing the technologies that would allow their settlement to survive across generations of continuous occupation. Barkai and Loran proposed something even more disturbing in their analysis. They argued that the tower may represent the first known monumental structure designed to convey political and ideological power. The position of the tower, the architecture of the interior staircase, and the visual dominance of the structure within the small mud brick settlement all suggest that someone in PPNA Jericho commanded enough authority to direct the construction of a monument unlike anything else in the contemporary world. The egalitarian society of pure hunter-gatherers may already have been giving way to the hierarchical structures that would define every later civilization. The truly disturbing aspect is what the tower represents in the broader context of this list. The Wall of Jericho was the first defensive structure. The Tower of Jericho was the first monumental religious or political architecture. Both were built within the same century, in the same location, by the same community. Whatever transformation in human society produced them happened in the same valley where the first agricultural villages had been growing wheat and barley for thousands of years. And it happened during the climate transition that drowned every coastal civilization across the surrounding world. The tower has stood inside its mound for 10,000 years. The staircase still leads upward through its interior, and what its builders intended to climb toward, what they wanted to be able to see from the top, has been buried under 10 millennia of accumulated history that we can only begin to interpret. Number 2. Tel Caramel and the towers that came before everything. In 1999, a joint Polish-Syrian archaeological mission led by Professor Ryszard Mazurowski of Warsaw University began excavating a low mound approximately 25 kilometers north of Aleppo, Syria, in the basin of the Quake River. The site is called Tel Caramel, and what the team uncovered across the following decade has pushed the timeline of monumental human construction back further than any other excavation in the pre-pottery Neolithic record. Beneath the surface layers of the Tel, Mazurowski's team uncovered the remains of 5 successive circular stone towers. The towers had been built one on top of another across centuries of occupation, each new structure incorporating fragments of its predecessor. The earliest of these towers has been radiocarbon dated using charcoal samples from the Gadam Center in Gleiss, Poland, to approximately 10,650 BCE. This date, confirmed across multiple analyses and cross-referenced against the stratigraphic context of the site, makes the Tel Caramel Towers approximately 2,000 years older than the Tower of Jericho. They are currently the oldest known stone tower structures anywhere on Earth. The dimensions are striking. The earliest tower measured approximately 6 meters in diameter, with walls thick enough to support significant vertical construction. The fourth and most massive phase reached 7.5 meters in diameter, with stone walls 2.25 meters thick. The towers were built using rounded, undressed limestone stones of various sizes stacked into self-supporting cylindrical structures that have left their foundations preserved for almost 13,000 years. The dating of the site, with horizons spanning from approximately 10,900 BCE to 8,800 BCE, places the construction of the earliest towers near the very end of the Younger Dryas Cold period during the climate transition that ended the last ice age. The communities that built Tel Caramel were not farmers in any meaningful sense. The paleobotanical analysis published by George Wilcox and Linda Herver indicates that the inhabitants were primarily gatherers of wild cereals rather than cultivators of domesticated crops. They hunted gazelle, aurochs, and wild boar. They gathered wild plants from the surrounding fertile valley. They did not yet have the agricultural surplus that conventional models of civilization argue was a prerequisite for monumental construction. And yet, somehow, they built towers. The function of the structures has not been definitively established. The lower oldest tower contained an elevated central hearth flanked by 2 benches, suggesting some form of communal or ceremonial use. The fourth tower showed evidence of fire damage and rebuilding, possibly indicating defensive function in its later phases, although there is no evidence of contemporary military threats that would explain the need for defense. The towers may have served as sanctuaries, gathering places, ceremonial centers, or some combination of functions that we cannot reconstruct from the surviving evidence. Whatever they were for, the inhabitants of Tel Caramel invested enormous effort in their construction across multiple generations of continuous occupation. What makes Tel Caramel particularly unsettling is the timeline it establishes. The earliest tower at the site was built approximately 12,650 years ago. This means that monumental stone construction by human communities predates the end of the last ice age. It predates the global flooding events that drowned Doggerland, submerged Sundayland, and reshaped every coastline on Earth. It predates the development of agriculture, the domestication of animals, the invention of pottery, and almost every other marker that conventional archaeology uses to define the threshold of civilization. And it occurred in northern Syria during the same window in which Göbekli Tepe was beginning to take shape just a few hundred kilometers to the north. The truly disturbing aspect is what Tel Caramel implies about the lost civilizations of the Near East at the end of the Ice Age. The communities that built these towers were not isolated. They participated in trade networks that extended across the Levant. They shared cultural traditions with the populations that would later raise the T-shaped pillars of Göbekli Tepe and Karahan Tepe. They were part of a broader civilization building effort that occurred during the catastrophic climate transition that ended the Pleistocene and began the Holocene. The Great Flood that drowned Doggerland, submerged the Black Sea Basin, and erased Sundayland was happening at the same time that Tel Caramel was being constructed. The towers stand as evidence that something extraordinary was occurring in the Fertile Crescent during the same window in which the rest of the world was being remade by rising seas. Excavations at Tel Caramel were suspended in 2011 due to the Syrian civil war. The site sits in a contested region of one of the most damaged archaeological landscapes on Earth, and what remains of its towers is preserved beneath layers of sediment that no one is currently in a position to investigate. The earliest stone tower in the world, built nearly 13,000 years ago by people whose names and language we will never recover, waits for a piece that has not yet arrived. Number 1. Göbekli Tepe and Karahan Tepe and the temple complex at the dawn of the world. In 1994, a German archaeologist named Klaus Schmidt arrived at a hilltop in southeastern Turkey near the city of Şanlıurfa, following up on a 1963 survey that had dismissed the site as a probable medieval cemetery. Schmidt recognised something the earlier team had missed. The hilltop was not natural. It was a mound of accumulated construction debris covering something far older than any medieval grave. Excavations began in 1995, and what emerged from the soil across the following decades has fundamentally rewritten the timeline of human civilization. Göbekli Tepe consists of at least 20 circular stone enclosures, each containing massive T-shaped limestone pillars arranged in concentric patterns. The pillars stand up to 5.5 metres tall and weigh as much as 16 tonnes. They are carved with elaborate reliefs depicting foxes, snakes, scorpions, vultures, lions and stylised human figures with arms and hands carved in relief along their sides. The construction required quarrying limestone from the surrounding bedrock, transporting blocks weighing up to 16 tonnes across distances of several hundred metres and erecting them into precise circular configurations using techniques whose specific details have never been reconstructed. Radiocarbon dating of the earliest exposed structures places their construction between approximately 9,500 and 9,000 BCE during the pre-pottery Neolithic A period. The largest complete enclosure uncovered so far, Enclosure D returned the oldest radiocarbon date measured at the site, approximately 9,530 BCE. The site was significantly expanded during the early 9th millennium BCE and remained in use until approximately 8,000 BCE, before being deliberately backfilled and abandoned. The builders of Göbekli Tepe were hunter-gatherers. They had no domesticated crops, no permanent settlements as conventional models define them, no metal tools, no pottery, and no written language. And yet they constructed the oldest known monumental architecture on Earth. Geophysical surveys of the broader hilltop suggest that at least 16 additional circular enclosures remain buried beneath the surface, with Schmidt himself estimating before his death in 2014 that only approximately 5% of the site had been excavated. Approximately 46 kilometres east of Göbekli Tepe sits its sister site, Karahan Tepe, occupied between 9,400 and 8,000 BCE. Excavations led by Necmi Karul of Istanbul University since 2019 have uncovered more than 250 T-shaped stone pillars, intricately carved human and animal sculptures, and a remarkable subterranean chamber containing 11 phallic pillars surrounding a central figure unlike anything found elsewhere. In 2025, Carroll's team uncovered an 11,000-year-old standing stone with a carved face featuring a prominent nose, deep-set eyes, and angular jaw, dated to the early 9th millennium BCE. The two sites are part of the broader Tash Tepela, the Stone Hills network which contains at least 20 contemporary pre-pottery Neolithic sites scattered across the Sanliurfa region. The Tash Tepela represents the largest concentration of monumental Neolithic construction anywhere on Earth, and the entire network was active during the climate transition that ended the last ice age. What makes Göbekli Tepe particularly unsettling is what it reveals about the cognitive capabilities of its builders. The carvings on the pillars show consistent artistic traditions across multiple enclosures, suggesting specialists who trained in stonecraft during an era when stonecraft was not supposed to exist at sophisticated levels. Pillar 43. The so-called vulture stone in Enclosure D contains a complex iconographic arrangement that researchers including Martin Sweatman of the University of Edinburgh have argued may encode astronomical information. Sweatman published analysis in 2024 proposing that the carvings on Pillar 43 record the date of a comet impact that occurred approximately 12,800 years ago, the same impact event that has been proposed as the trigger for the Younger Dryas climate reversal. If his interpretation is correct, the builders of Göbekli Tepe were preserving the memory of a cosmic catastrophe that had occurred approximately 3,000 years before they began carving the pillar. Mainstream archaeologists remain skeptical of Sweatman's specific claims, but the broader implication remains. The Göbekli Tepe builders were tracking time, encoding information into stone, and creating a sophisticated symbolic vocabulary that has not been definitively decoded. The truly disturbing aspect is what happened to the site. Around 8,000 BCE, after approximately 1,500 years of continuous use and modification, the inhabitants of Göbekli Tepe did something inexplicable. They deliberately buried the entire complex, They filled the enclosures with tons of carefully deposited rubble, soil, and animal bones. They sealed the pillars beneath an artificial mound. They transformed a sacred complex into a hidden landscape, and then they walked away. The burial was not gradual. It was systematic, organised, and intentional. Whatever Göbekli Tepe was, the people who built it eventually decided that it needed to be hidden, and they hid it so thoroughly that the site remained unknown for the next 10,000 years. Karahan Tepe was deliberately buried in the same way at the end of its occupation. Whatever drove the builders of the Tash Tepela to construct their monuments at the end of the Ice Age also drove them to entomb the structures when they were finished with them. The truly horrifying implication is what this list ultimately reveals about the deep past. The 10 megastructures we have walked through were all constructed during a single narrow window in human prehistory between approximately 12,000 and 6,000 years ago. This window corresponds precisely to the great flooding events that ended the Pleistocene, drowned every coastline on Earth, and erased entire continents from the maps of the ancient world. Doggerland disappeared. Sundayland disappeared. The Black Sea basin filled with salt water. The Mediterranean coastline retreated by hundreds of kilometres. Atlit Yam, the city beneath the waves of the Israeli coast, was just one of countless coastal communities that drowned during this period. The flood myths preserved in the mythology of every ancient civilization, from the Epic of Gilgamesh to the biblical account of Noah, from Greek Deucalion to Hindu Manu, may all be derived from cultural memories of this same global event. The megastructures on this list represent what survived. They are the monuments of cultures that built on high ground, on volcanic platforms on hilltops far from the rising seas. Everything else, every coastal civilization that did not retreat to high ground in time, was consumed by the water and lies beyond our reach. We are reading the prehistory of the world from the pages that did not drown. The pages that drowned, and there must have been many of them, are scattered across continental shelves and submerged plains and shallow Caribbean platforms where archaeology cannot easily follow. Göbekli Tepe was deliberately buried by its builders. They did this for reasons we cannot reconstruct, but the burial preserved the site through the entire arc of subsequent human history. Whoever they were, whatever they believed, however much they understood about the world they were leaving behind, they hid their temple from the future. And the future found it anyway. 11,500 years later, in a hilltop in southeastern Turkey, where a German archaeologist looked at a low mound and realised that what lay beneath it was older than every civilization he had ever studied. Everything we know about the deep past begins with the structures on this list. Everything we do not know lies beneath the water, between the layers of soil that have not yet been excavated and behind the ceremonial closures that the original builders performed when they decided that what they had created needed to be hidden from whatever came next. The Great Flood is not a myth. It is the geological and climatic transition that reshaped every coastline on the planet at the end of the last ice age, and the structures that survived it are the only direct witnesses we have to what came before. If you want to see more videos like this, click the video on screen now and make sure to subscribe.